Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Business Essentials podcast. I'm your host, Veronika, and today we're going to be speaking with Amee Quiriconi. She's the host of the podcast, One Broken Mom, an author, a coach, and a business consultant. I was super excited when she applied to be on the show because she's a business consultant with a perspective that I've never seen before. Stay tuned to hear what she has to say.
Tony Robbins once said, "No matter how many mistakes you make or how slow you progress, you are still way ahead of everyone who isn't trying." This is the Biz Essentials. You want to grow, get ahead, keep the spark. Here you'll get valuable insights and empowerment to grow personally and professionally. Isn't it about time you turn your dreams into successful passion projects? Learn how to be productive, be successful, be joyful, and more importantly, be yourself. The B Essentials. This is the Biz Essentials. And this is your host, Veronika of Veronika Ventures.
I was super excited when you said you wanted to be on the podcast because when I saw the name of your podcast and what it is that you do, I was very intrigued. And most of that, I have to say selfishly, is because it's something that affects me greatly. I actually have a traumatic childhood as well. So I'm curious to see what it is that you do and how you help people kind of incorporate their trauma into their business lives and not let it affect them.
Well, I have been an entrepreneur. You can probably trace it all the way back to middle school, when I was writing poems and selling them for $5 to my classmates. I got through college and I got an engineering degree and went into, the corporate world, just like a lot of people might do if that's a path that they take. And I had an opportunity through just a lot of really great experiences in life and also living up in the Seattle area to be introduced to a lot of really cool fields. One of them was sustainable building design and construction and stuff like that. And I decided at some point I wanted to go back and get a master's degree so that I could work mostly in policy development. At least that's what I thought. And when I got my master's and was working on it, my practicum, I realized I was not cut for government work. It was just a little too slow for me. And I actually got my master's shortly after the WTO riots in Seattle, which anybody in the Gen X would probably remember, the big, kerfuffle that we had up here. Some of my classmates were people that were down on the street getting tear gassed and, all that. And I'm like, man, that's not me either. I'm all in for social change and social justice and all that. But, I needed to know where I really actually fit in the system. And what I found is that I kept coming back to business. Business is such a powerful tool to be able to change lives. And, we hear and see so many businesses that do bad things for their communities and for their employees and the environment. And I felt like if you could actually infiltrate the business community and you could bring good values, that you could actually change it that way because evidence, everybody needs proof that if it's good for business, you got to show that it's good for business. So I ended up inventing a recycled content countertop product and I built a company and I grew it to nationwide distribution. And I did that and I had fun. And then the recession came and crushed all of my dreams. But what it did was it put me on this really strange path. Out of survival, I ended up partnering with another company in that, in the midst of the recession, I made a lot of emotional decisions that I wasn't aware that I was really making emotional decisions. Things like not wanting to lay off my employees and not trusting my gut and this wiggle that I got that, this might not be a good situation for me, but doing it anyways. And what I found myself in was in a terribly toxic situation from the workplace environment with this really bad partnership. And then going home and having two small children and a husband who really didn't want to hear about any of my problems because he just kind of thought it was my fault. He wanted me to close my company when I didn't want to. And so I was being kind of blamed for that decision. And I had no resources and I broke and fell apart. And my marriage came apart. I became a part-time mom instead of a full-time mom. And that was the beginning of this period of time that I call my dark woman phase, where I didn't know what was happening to me, but I did know that I didn't want to grow up to be like my mom. And yet here I was doing some of the same things she was doing. And I didn't know why I was doing it. And it's not like I had my awakening then. It would take another 7 years for me to try to reinvent and understand myself, but with a fraction of the awareness that I had right now of what was really, really happening in my life. And I ended up in an abusive relationship. But on top of that, still had great business success on it because I went into a totally different field and was able to grow, some really cool companies that way. So I never linked business success with my own mental health and awareness until it all came apart again in 2017. And I was in almost the same situation as I was before. And my mathematical brain went, holy crap, there's something going on here. And it's your fault, probably. And so that's when I decided to, instead of keeping my energy outwardly focused on helping other people and solving their problems, I decided what would happen to me if I actually focused on me and solved my own problem. And it changed my life. I needed to understand, why I was committing self-sabotage, why parenting was hard for me. I mean, because that was really important to me because in the course of 2017, my kid's dad no longer wanted to be the custodial parent because he had these two teenagers he didn't understand. And so I stepped up and said, yeah, I'm taking them. But then I felt really still trapped. Like it felt overwhelming to be that role. So I knew I wasn't resourced and tooled up to be a good mom, at least a mom that they needed. And by the end of the year, I discovered that what was really underneath everything was my history of trauma and complex post-traumatic stress from, an event and series of events in my life that I overcame. I air quote that because, we do, a lot of us survivors have overcome a lot of stuff, but I didn't ever understand how the neuroscience of all that actually plays out, that there are real pathways built in our brain, that brain architecture is constructed from our experiences, and they are real things, real connections that are real happening inside of our heads. And when we grow up in trauma and dysfunction, our wires are messed up, plain and simple. And we learn to adapt, we learn to survive, but unfortunately, it's not a perfect process. And so the things that were getting in my way in business, the things that got in my way in my professional lives in terms of picking bad business partners for one, picking bad romantic partners, and feeling trapped and not understanding why I didn't have all the tools for being a mother, were all related to understanding all of that. Then after a couple of years of studying that and also podcasting, my podcast, One Broken Mom, was my journey of this awareness and building and reaching out to all these experts and asking questions that everybody else has on the top, the top of their mind, becoming an advocate for mental health, for all adults, whether they have kids or not. I then began to see that there was a way of connecting this to my passion, which was business. I still felt like businesses are a great place. If you can infiltrate the system, you can make great changes. And so that's when I decided that I was going to infiltrate the business world with mental health. And I would start by working with entrepreneurs themselves, women in particular, and also being able to work with companies and organizations, bringing a trauma-informed perspective to our leadership so that we know how to create psychologically safe workplaces and companies. Because that's what happened to me. Was I was unsafe at work. It triggered me. It sent me home. And then where was I supposed to go if I had no relief at home? I don't want to see that happen to anybody. And so that's how it's all kind of like linked together in, what I'm doing right now through writing and coaching and consulting.
Wow, there's so much good stuff in there. I don't even know where to start. I feel like I'm like traveling the same path, but like way behind you. But one thing that I wanted to touch on is you mentioned a trauma-informed perspective. What exactly is a trauma-informed perspective?
The biggest piece of that is just being aware how prevalent trauma actually is in our society. And when I talk about trauma, usually, my reference point is the trauma that we've already experienced in our past. And, a lot of people think of trauma in the big T definition of it, which is the obvious trauma, like being molested while growing up, witnessing or being physically or sexually abused while growing up, seeing a disaster, being in a tragic accident. I mean, all the things that, that we can very easily identify as like, yeah, that is a traumatic event, obviously. There's also the small T traumas, which has really been the newer kind of addition to our understanding of childhood development. And that is the impact of emotional neglect. And not necessarily being flat out ignored by parents who just didn't like you or didn't care about you, but not having the right responses, serve and return responses that we need as our brain is learning throughout the course of our childhood. Sometimes we have experienced emotional neglect because, for example, as most of us can identify with, our parents are getting divorced. Now, as an adult, if you've ever been through a divorce, which I have, you're like sapped. It's hard. You're a human being going through a very emotional period. And sometimes you don't have enough for yourself, let alone turning around and addressing the emotional needs of your children. And so when we, as a Gen X, for example, I mean, we're kind of the generation that the parents ignored, right? Like that's our
Right.
hallmark. That lack of, connection sometimes actually is received by the brain as I'm not getting enough stimulation. I'm not getting enough feedback. We can take it all in and internalize it and make it like our fault, right? That's the way the brain works. And it
Right.
becomes then belief systems that we actually end up happening. And so when you actually look, and ACEs was a study that was released in 1998, and it was between the CDC and Kaiser Permanente out of San Diego. And what Kaiser Permanente did is that they sent out surveys to 17,000 of the members within the San Diego area in their insurance plan. They gave them 10 questions, which they called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Questionnaire, and they identified the connection between the adversities that we experience as children growing up before the age of 18 and how it links to our long-term physical health. That blew the roof off of the awareness of, again, of prevalence, because over, 2/3 of the participants had experienced at least one adverse childhood experience, and about 20% experienced 4 or more. And when you got to the 4 or more level, you saw like a 70% increase in bad health outcomes. Now, then after that, dozens of follow-up studies took place and started to look at like, okay, well, do adverse childhood experiences affect us at work? Do they affect us in personal relationships? I mean, people started to run with that data. And at the end, like I said, the takeaway is that we realize that a lot of people have experienced trauma more than we realize. And so if we bring that into our leadership and our responsibility as leaders in organizations and companies, then we begin to tailor and tune how we lead people if we know that somewhere there's a story we don't know about, and that it's possible through our work environments and through our interactions, we could end up stirring those traumas back up for people. We could be re-triggering people. And if we do that, sometimes we respond as leaders to the result of that, of somebody getting defensive, somebody, their performance lowering, and then we punish them for the response to the fact that we might have triggered them to begin with. And so that's where
Right.
bringing that all back to our leadership is first, let's just know it's out there. So then how do we lead companies and people differently if we know that we're all harboring something in our past that we probably don't bring to work because there's been too many stigmas around mental health, and also a lack of awareness about this, that, people like to silo it and say, your mental health is your personal issue. Show up to work and I don't care. And that's just humanly impossible to shut off who we are as humans just because we walked across the threshold and into an office in the morning.
That's great that you are helping executives and companies know that, you have a workforce of maybe hundreds or thousands, and they're all different. And one of the things that one of my bosses did a long time ago was they sent out a questionnaire. Actually, when he started working there, he gave it to all the employees and specifically asked them, like, what kind of reward works for you? Like, what do you like? What makes you happy? And it was simple things like, I like it when my boss takes me to lunch. Guess what? Like 2 weeks later, he took me to lunch. Like, it was one of those things, like, was something that for me was special because you get to go out to lunch, you get the one-on-one time with the boss. It was a really good thing. And so if I ever have a large corporation, I'm definitely going to employ that. I want to hear how you've seen past traumatic experiences and our histories affect people in their workplace, because I know how it affects me, but I'd love to hear your perspective on how it affects people in their workplace.
It can get us in a lot of different places, and that's kind of what's unfortunate about it, and why it's important to kind of become aware, of our sense of our own state. Some of the places that trauma creeps in is, especially if you're a solopreneur or starting your own business, is our feelings of value and worth. And it's not just do I feel smart enough to do my job? We hear about this thing called imposter syndrome, which isn't actually a mental disorder. It's just a condition of not believing the evidence that you are capable of doing something. That's typically a trauma response to having some belief systems planted in through behaviors that were modeled to us, or even overt messages of, you're not smart enough or you're incapable or whatever. And those feelings of worth then actually come out in pricing and services and giving away our intellect and not, charging enough for it. And then when we're asked to charge for it, feeling really shaky about it. And you don't even have to own your own company for that to affect you. It affects you in your sense of entitlement when you go and ask for a raise, or don't ever negotiate a raise because you are worried about the rejection and the loss of connection. I mean, that is a trauma response when you feel so scared to be assertive, which is totally normal and totally, acceptable for you to go and want to have a conversation like that with your boss, or with a client about what your values should be. But that's one way that trauma creeps into it. And that becomes a self-sabotage because the trauma is guiding your action, and your action is undercutting your future because you never make enough money to be able to keep moving forward in life because you're too afraid to push it. The other way trauma comes up that we see is in communication. It's pretty easy there. I call them communication habits. Some people call them communication styles. But, when we're triggered at work, and we don't even have to necessarily have like complex, post-traumatic stress in our backgrounds or a high degree of trauma. But when we become activated or stressed or, put in a sense of psychological danger at work, like someone's yelling at us, for example, a trauma response for a person who has a fight system, right? Fight or flight, a fight system will become aggressive. If they don't know that signal is going off in their head and they need to defend themselves. So they become aggressive, belligerent. They might start yelling, cutting people off, getting into fist fights if it gets really bad, I guess. But then there's the opposite of that, which is a person who has the flight sympathetic nervous response, to stress, and they'll become withdrawn and want to shrink and stop talking and might get flustered, and their anxiety levels might start to shoot through the roof. And so that is something where trauma, either in the past or happening in the moment, can show up with, with communication. And then I think one of the biggest things that I end up seeing is that if you grew up with a lot of dysfunction, it means that you grew up with a lot of dysfunctional people. And what that can do to us is it can really kind of set the world for us and get really trained at working really well with dysfunctional people. And those dysfunctional people likely didn't like to honor boundaries. And so we didn't learn how to set boundaries. And then the self-sabotage is we work with people we should say no to. My end of that story was, again, I go back to picking bad business partners. My gut said that they were bad, but my brain also told me, but hey, that's okay. You're used to people like this, so you can figure this out. And at the end, those are never sustainable relationships. And so we end up with this boundary setting that we have to do. And again, then the fear starts to creep up of like, but I don't want them to be mad at me, and I don't want to, them to reject me. And that's all that little kid inside of you that had to like figure out how to survive challenging parents or, whatever your family situation, starting to come up and taking over your decision-making process that they shouldn't be doing. It should be the adult version of you. Those tend to be like the three, like I'd say, big areas that I see, especially for entrepreneurs, and there are a multitude of other ways, but I mean, it all depends on the person and your experience.
Absolutely. Wow. Again, so much to unpack. So going back to what you were saying, definitely, I think it is a journey of self-exploration on the employee side, but also I love that you're working with employers. So I think it's a combination of both. I wanted you to tell us a little bit about where people can find you and get to know you more, because wow, you have a lot of information and I wish I could talk to you all day.
Awesome. Well, thank you for asking me that. My easiest place to kind of jump in and get to know me is at my website, ameequiriconi.com. And I'm sure there'll be links in the podcast notes, so you don't have to worry about spelling all of that.
Of course.
But I do have a book. So if you actually are an entrepreneur and have started a business, and this is, while it's the Fearless Woman's Guide to Starting a Business, the reality is that if you're stalled even in your entrepreneurial pursuits, it could be a great book. And and I write about what my experience is being an entrepreneur for over 20 years, owning a lot of different types of companies and running other companies, have found like, what do you really need to know if you want to be successful? And it's a lot of what you and I just talked about here, which is raising our awareness of what our past is, because the quality of our childhood experiences equals the quality of the adult skills that we end up developing. And we weren't supposed to be born with the skills. That's what I always want to tell everybody, but we were born with the capacity to learn them. However, if the environment we grew up in didn't teach us those skills, of course, we're lacking in some of those. It's no judgment. There's no shame or guilt. We don't have to feel guilty about that. That's what happens. That's how the math adds up. And if you have some deficiencies, I'll call them then, or opportunities to strengthen some of these adult skills, you need to jump on that, because they are the same skills that you're going to need for your business. And if you don't, your business is just going to spiral, and either make you feel unhappy doing it, or it just isn't going to actually make you any money, like for some of the self-sabotaging reasons I talked about. So that book's a great place there. And then I actually, for the people that read the book, I actually started a book club, which is a membership group where, there's monthly calls and stuff like that. It's very kind of low price to enter into it, because I've been in that situation where I'm starting a business and I have $0, but I want to learn because I am like hungry for knowledge. So the book club might be a good place there. But when you get to the website, you'll see the book, you'll see a link to my podcast, which is called One Broken Mom. And that's just all about mental health. So that's about the journey of childhood trauma. It is my interviews with experts. It's a weekly show. However, I do have seasons that are limited. And so season 4 will be wrapping up by the end of October. And then I'll take a break because I just can't do it every weekend, every month. But it's a great place. I've had some really wonderful people on the show that I'm very proud of. People that wrote the books that changed my life. They are guests on my show. And so I highly encourage for anybody that's actually exploring their trauma and then trying to understand that. And then on LinkedIn, you can follow me to find out like my business, perspectives and stuff like that.
That's awesome. So yeah, I'll be picking up a copy of that book because clearly I still need it. I think for those of you who might be listening to this and think like, I don't have any trauma, like it's totally fine. There are things in your past, or at least in my experience, that you may not realize still affect the way that you behave and act. Something that is part of my life that wasn't traumatic at all is the way my family communicates. There was no direct, like, can you please do this? It was all based on like insinuation, like, it would be nice if you did this. Like you never
passive aggressive.
Yeah, passive aggressive, but that's such a nasty term to me. Like it wasn't aggressive at all. Like it was just like well, if you knew me, you'd do it. So I guess it is kind of a passive aggressive. But that has made communication with people for me really different, because there's a lot of times when people will say something, or especially like via text or email, where I'm like, what are they really trying to say? And so I had to learn to say like, hey, by the way, I don't know how to communicate. I don't know how to read this. Could you please let me know if this is really what you mean? Or if you mean something else, just tell me, because like, it's really hard for me to pick up that cue and I'll self-doubt all day long. Like if they say something like, let's say, you don't have to come to the meeting. Well, do I really not have to, or did you not want me to? Like totally different things, and it'll affect me and spiral me in 2 totally different ways. And so it's very much about knowing what it is that affects you and how to work with those things, because they're part of us. You can't get rid of them, unfortunately, but you can, as my therapist would say, learn to manage them.
Absolutely. And neuroplasticity, I always say that that's the great hope. Back in the day, we got this message like from the egg in the frying pan, and that we killed off all of our brain cells and we were done for, right? It was to get us to stop smoking weed. But the reality is that the brain does actually change. And depending on the depth of the repetition of some of the traumas that we experienced, or the habits that we have built, and the styles, that have been ingrained in there, if that rut is really deep, it is impossible to some extent to change them forever. But we can be aware when they come up, and then we can hit a pause button and we can start to work on something new. But some things we can actually change. We can neutralize some of our feelings about bad experiences so that they don't keep triggering us again. But to go to your point about the leaders, I do experiences where leaders don't think of themselves as, dealing with trauma, that trauma is not their problem. Then this is my challenge to them. What kind of company do you want to have, and what kind of organization do you want to have? What kind of legacy do you want to leave for people? Because when you think about the way that trauma is passed down from generation to generation, and if your organization is the type of place where it does not support its employees, it has a policy and a culture of mishandling and misbehaving and bullying, your legacy is the people that are going home to their partners and their families and venting that out at their children or their partners there. And personally, that's not a legacy I want to be left with. I'd rather have the opposite effect of that. And so even if trauma is not your issue, it's at work, whether you acknowledge it or not. Be the kind of human being that cares about other people. And then guess what? Here's what happens on the bottom line with companies that have healthy workplace cultures. They actually do better.
If your employees are working at maximum efficiency because they're not triggered, I mean, you can't do better than that. So definitely a good place for everyone to tackle this very prevalent situation. And hopefully through the generations, it's going to be less and less, right? Hopefully. I want to thank you so much for being here today and imparting all of this wonderful knowledge. I really, really learned something, and I hope my listeners did too. And I'm going to pick up a copy of your book because it sounds awesome.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, I appreciate being here.
Wow. Am I the only one that was totally moved by that interview? I feel like I've learned so much, and I am absolutely ecstatic that she's out there putting out this message of not only self-acceptance, but of creating a trauma-informed environment, whether it be within your own community, business, or even your home. I hope you guys learned as much as I did, and we'll see you next time on the Biz Essentials.
You've been listening to the Biz Essentials. Thanks for listening to the show. We hope you've gotten some useful and practical information, learning how to be productive, be successful, be joyful, and more importantly, be yourself, and turning your dreams into successful passion projects. By listening to this show, you've already set into motion the most important part, starting. So it's important to catch the next episode. Make sure to like, rate, and review the show. In the meantime, hook up with us on social media at Veronika Ventures and at the Biz Essentials. Till next time, this is the Biz Essentials.
So today's quote of the day is by George Eliot. He said, "It's never too late to be who you might have been." So go out there and create some joy in your life and for others. And we'll see you next time on the Biz Essentials.